The Spanish Empire, Conquest, and Collapse. The empire that never slept. There's a certain sound that echoes through history. The creak of old ships in a restless harbor, the low groan of masts swaying in Atlantic winds, the clatter of boots on wet stone in a port city that smells faintly of salt, sweat, and destiny. It's the sound of a world about to change, and of men who think they can own it. The year is 1492, and Spain, newly united, newly hungry, is standing on the edge of everything. Europe is barely awake from its medieval slumber. The Black Death is a fading nightmare, the 100 Years' War a grim memory. But Spain, Spain, is just getting started. The banners of Castile and Aragon now fly side by side, fluttering like two stubborn lovers who finally decided to stop fighting and get married. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs, have done what countless kings before them only dreamed of. They've stitched together the patchwork quilt of Iberia into something resembling a nation. And to mark the occasion, they decide to finish an old story, one that had been going on for almost 800 years. The Reconquista, the long, slow, grinding Christian push to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, finally ends with the fall of Granada. The red banner of Islam is lowered from the Alhambra, replaced by the cross of Christ. The air, they say, smelled of gunpowder, smoke, and victory, and perhaps, faintly, of arrogance. The Catholic monarchs had done it. Spain was whole, Christian, triumphant, and, because history always likes a good twist, that same year, a wiry Italian sailor with a questionable sense of geography convinced them to fund a voyage to somewhere he called the Indies. Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colon as he called himself in Spanish, would set sail westward believing he could reach Asia by cutting through the Atlantic. He was wrong, of course. But like most men who were wrong in just the right way, he changed everything. We hear the waves, the wooden groan of ships, the nervous murmur of sailors whispering prayers to saints they half believe in. 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. 3 months of endless blue. No land, no birds, no hope. And then the cry. Tierra! It's strange, isn't it? That one word, shouted into a night thick with fear, would set in motion the rise of an empire that would stretch from the mountains of Peru to the islands of the Philippines. An empire where the sun, supposedly, would never set. Though, as we'll see, it did, and quite dramatically.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand the Spanish Empire, its glory, its madness, its slow collapse, we have to go back further. Because Spain didn't appear out of nowhere, glittering and imperial. It was born out of centuries of fire and faith, forged in wars that were as much about religion as they were about land. For almost 800 years, the Iberian Peninsula was a battleground between Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim states in the south. It wasn't just war, it was identity building. Generation after generation of Spaniards grew up fighting infidels, crusading in their own backyard. So when Columbus stumbled upon a whole new world filled with people who didn't know Christ, didn't wear armor, and didn't have cannons, well, to Spain, it must have felt like destiny knocking twice. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine Spain in the late 15th century. Narrow cobbled streets winding through stone towns, church bells echoing at dawn, markets alive with oranges, olives, and the clink of silver coins, a land drenched in sunlight and paranoia. Because while Spain had united under one crown and one faith, it had done so by force. The Inquisition was already hard at work, sniffing out heretics, Jews, and Muslims who had converted a little too conveniently. Terror wore the robe of piety. The air was thick with incense and fear. And yet, out of that paranoia came purpose. Spain told itself a story that it was God's chosen hammer, meant to strike the unbelievers of the world and bring light to the darkness. It was a story of holy mission, of divine right. It was also, conveniently, a story that justified taking whatever you wanted from whoever had it. Now, back to our friend Columbus. He returns to Spain not with spices or silk, but with something far more intoxicating. The idea of another world, an entire continent filled with potential and gold. Gold that glimmered in the eyes of monarchs, merchants, and murderers alike. Within a generation, Spanish conquistadors would flood the New World like ants on a spilled drop of honey. Men like Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, names that would echo through time, often for reasons both heroic and horrifying. They came with swords and crosses, with priests and cannons, and they came with something else, an unshakable conviction that God himself had given them the right to rule. The Spanish Empire was not built slowly. It erupted, violent, dazzling, unstoppable. One decade, Spain was a European kingdom recovering from centuries of war. The next, it was a global colossus with its hands in 3 continents and its ships sailing every sea. It's hard to overstate how fast it happened. Think about it. Within 60 years of Columbus's first voyage, Spain had conquered Mexico, Peru, and most of the Caribbean. Silver poured in from mines in Potosí and Zacatecas like liquid sunlight. The wealth was unimaginable, so much silver that it distorted the entire European economy. And Spain, for a brief moment, looked like the richest, most powerful empire the world had ever seen. But if you looked closer, beneath the gold, beneath the glory, you'd see the cracks already forming. Empires, like ships, look strongest right before they begin to sink. The irony is that Spain's empire was born from desperation as much as ambition. The Reconquista had left the country exhausted, its fields barren, its nobility restless. When the New World appeared, it wasn't just opportunity, it was escape. An escape from poverty, from obscurity, from insignificance. So thousands left. Soldiers, peasants, monks, criminals, all heading west, drawn by rumors of mountains of silver, cities of gold, and people who bowed at the sight of horses. They crossed oceans for fortune, and found, more often than not, disease, madness, and death. But still they came, because Spain, for a time, believed in its destiny, and destiny is a hard addiction to shake. A Spanish port at dawn, mist clinging to the water, a ship creaks at the dock, ropes heavy with dew. Men board in silence, armor clinking softly, crosses around their necks glinting in the half-light. A priest raises a hand in blessing, a gull cries overhead, and somewhere in the captain's chest lies a royal charter written in ornate Latin, granting him permission to claim whatever land he can reach in the name of the King of Spain and of God Almighty. The sails unfurl, the wind catches, and the empire that never slept, begins its long, golden, blood-soaked dream.
Dreams of gold and God. They said the world ended at the horizon, and maybe it did, until Spain decided to sail past it. By the early 1500s, Spain had become the nerve center of an unfolding miracle, or catastrophe, depending on which side of the ocean you happen to stand. Columbus's voyages had done more than reveal a new world. They had opened a wound in the earth, a gash through which faith, greed, and ambition began to pour. And Spain, still dizzy from its Reconquista victory, believed the discovery was proof of divine favor. You could feel it in the sermons, the songs, the whispers in taverns.
God had rewarded his chosen kingdom with a second Eden, one full of gold, souls to convert, and opportunities to be seized in the name of both heaven and the crown. It was a story that made perfect sense to a people raised on crusades. But paradise, as always, came with an entry fee. The first years in the Caribbean were less golden age and more grinding nightmare. The islands were beautiful, impossibly so. The air heavy with flowers, the sea so blue it looked painted. But beneath the palm trees, disease stalked the camps. Mosquitoes hummed like tiny executioners. Food rotted. Sailors mutinied. And the indigenous peoples, the Taino, the Arawak, and others whose names most of Europe would never bother to learn, paid the highest price of all. They were curious at first, welcoming these spale strangers with gifts and food. Then the strangers demanded more, and more. And when gold was nowhere to be found, they took bodies instead. Enslavement, punishment, extermination. Within a generation, entire islands were nearly empty. Columbus had found the New World, but Spain was already busy destroying it. Still, to the Spanish court, those grim realities were abstractions. Reports arrived dressed in optimism, rich lands, docile peoples, opportunities for conversion. When complaints surfaced about brutality, the solution was simply to baptize the victims before killing them. Problem solved, eternal souls saved. Because of course they did. But there was something else hidden beneath the piety, a fever that would consume Europe for centuries. Gold. Gold that glittered in rivers and stories, gold that priests claimed was a sign of God's blessing, gold that turned men into wolves. Spain's empire would be built on it, and destroyed by it. The Caribbean becomes a gateway. From there, expeditions fanned out in every direction, some authorized, many not. Every ambitious man with a sword and a ship imagines himself a new Columbus, a new Caesar. And out of that chaos steps one of the most dangerous kinds of men history ever produces, the conquistador. These were not disciplined armies. They were adventurers, mercenaries, gamblers of fate. Poor sons of noble families, desperate for land or legacy. Veterans of the Reconquista, still addicted to holy war. And to them, the New World was an unfinished crusade, just one fought under a hotter sun. Enter Hernán Cortés. When Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico in 1519, he was 34 years old, clever, ambitious, and dangerously persuasive. He had no royal authority to conquer anything, but that didn't stop him. He burned his ships to prevent retreat, because nothing says we're in this together than removing all exits, and marched inland with a few hundred men, some horses, and a priest to keep things respectable. What he found waiting was beyond imagining. The Aztec Empire, centered in the glittering city of Tenochtitlan, was a world unto itself. Floating gardens, stone temples, markets larger than any in Europe. To Cortés, it was both alien and magnificent. To Spain, it would become an obsession. Through manipulation, alliances with enemy tribes, and a mix of deception and sheer audacity, Cortés managed to overthrow an empire of millions. The siege of Tenochtitlan was brutal, biblical in scale. When it ended, the great city was ash and rubble, its canals choked with bodies. The temples that once honored gods of sun and rain were replaced with crosses, and Spain had found its first great treasure, the heart of Mexico.
Word of Cortés's triumph spread like wildfire. Europe's imagination ignited. If one man could topple a civilization, then there must be countless more waiting to be taken. Cue Francisco Pizarro, a man with fewer scruples and even more greed. In the 1530s, he sailed south toward rumors of another great kingdom, one perched high in the Andes, rich in gold, silver, and ceremony. The Inca Empire. The encounter between Pizarro and the Inca ruler Atahualpa is one of those scenes history reads like theater. A handful of Spaniards facing thousands of Incan warriors in a square in Cajamarca. Pizarro invites Atahualpa to a peaceful meeting.
The Spaniards bring muskets, cannons, and a priest. When Atahualpa refuses to convert, the priest drops his Bible and Pizarro gives the signal. In minutes, the Spanish slaughter thousands. The air fills with smoke, screams, and the thunder of gunfire echoing through the mountains. Atahualpa is captured, then ransomed for rooms filled with gold and silver, literally filled, from floor to ceiling. It was the largest ransom ever recorded, and of course, after receiving it, the Spaniards killed him anyway. Because that's how honor worked, apparently. By mid-century, Spain controlled an empire stretching from Mexico to Chile, vast, rich, and ruled in the name of God and the crown. From the port of Seville, ships sailed in convoys, the flotas, across the Atlantic, their holds stuffed with silver and spices, their decks lined with cannons to ward off pirates. Every year, the treasure fleets returned to Spain like migrating stars, glimmering across the ocean night. But for all its grandeur, there was something grotesque about the spectacle. The empire ran on suffering, the labor of millions of indigenous people and enslaved Africans, whose hands mined the silver that adorned Spanish cathedrals and paid for European wars. It was glory built on graves. There were those who saw it clearly even then. Men like Bartolomé de las Casas, a priest who witnessed the cruelty firsthand and wrote against it. He described the Caribbean as a place so depopulated that it looked like an open tomb. His words were meant as warning. They became instead a record of conscience Spain chose to forget. Because by now, empire wasn't just politics, it was religion. And religion, once fused with power, becomes a fire that refuses to go out. The missionaries followed the soldiers, and the cross followed the sword. Churches rose over razed temples. Indigenous gods were rebranded as saints. Faith and conquest danced together in an uneasy waltz, one sanctifying the other. By the late 1500s, Spain was no longer just a kingdom, it was a global organism. Its veins ran from the silver mines of Potosi to the galleons of Manila, through the sugar fields of the Caribbean and into the cathedrals of Madrid. Every ounce of gold, every bar of silver, every drop of blood, all flowed toward the same heart, the Spanish crown. And at that heart sat Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, basically the human embodiment of a title list too long for a single business card. He ruled more territory than any monarch before him. He saw himself as the defender of Christendom, a man chosen by God to hold the world together. But the world is never good at staying held. The Reformation was tearing Europe apart, wars raged, deaths mounted, and Spain's endless flow of silver somehow never seemed enough. Because silver, like sin, loses its value when there's too much of it. The irony of empire is that its greatest triumphs are often the seeds of its ruin. Every new conquest demanded more ships, more soldiers, more taxes. Every ounce of gold inflated prices, corrupted officials, and fed endless wars in Europe. Spain became addicted to its own success, unable to stop expanding, unable to stop spending. And all the while, beneath the glory, its foundations were hollowing out. But in the 1500s, no one could see that. To the world, Spain was divine, unstoppable, terrifying. Its armies marched across Europe under the banner of the Habsburg eagle, its ships ruled the seas, its colonies bled riches. The sun, it seemed, would never set on Spain. And yet, you can almost hear it, in the silence between the cannon blasts, the first faint echoes of fatigue. A single Spanish coin falls onto a wooden table. It spins, gleaming in candlelight, stamped with the royal crest and the Latin words plus ultra, farther beyond. The motto of a people who believed there was always another horizon to conquer, another world to take, another soul to save. But even the brightest coin, if you spin it long enough, begins to wobble. The Spanish Empire is rich, is vast, It is unstoppable. And yet, somewhere deep within its golden heart, the cracks are beginning to sing.
The Conquistadors' shadow. The empire had found its rhythm. Ships came and went like clockwork, sails swelling against the Atlantic winds, cargo holds glittering with the wealth of continents, gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, spices, and, quietly, people. Spain was no longer a kingdom looking for fortune. It was fortune, minted, measured, and sanctified. In the royal court of Madrid, power glowed like candlelight on polished armor. Ministers whispered beneath frescoed ceilings, charting the fates of lands they would never see. Princes and priests argued over whose authority came first, God's or the king's, while peasants back home struggled to afford bread that now cost more than silver could buy. But the galleons still came, and so the illusion held. Spain, for a shining century, was the center of the world. The empire stretched so far that the human mind could barely contain it. From the frozen peaks of the Andes to the humid jungles of the Philippines, from the deserts of Mexico to the African coast, from the gray waves of the Atlantic to the coral waters of the Pacific. The sun, they said, never set on Spanish soil, which was true, but only because it never had time to rest. Neither did the empire's subjects. Let's visit Potosi, in what is now Bolivia. At 13,000 feet above sea level, it was the highest city in the world, and for a time, the richest. From a distance, the mountain of Potosi gleamed red under the sun. The locals called it the Cerro Rico, the rich hill. Inside, it was honeycombed with tunnels, a labyrinth of greed and death. Indigenous laborers pressed into service through the Mita system, dug for silver day and night. The air was thick with dust and sweat. The walls groaned with the weight of the mountain above them. Every year, thousands died, crushed, poisoned by mercury, or simply swallowed by the dark. And yet the silver flowed. It flowed into bars, onto mule trains, to the ports of Lima and Panama, across the oceans to Seville, and from there into the hands of kings, merchants, and mercenaries. From Potosi alone came nearly half the world's silver for a century. Enough, it was said, to build a bridge of solid metal all the way to Spain. And still, it was never enough. The mines of Potosi became the empire's beating heart. Every heartbeat cost a life. Every breath of wealth was drawn from lungs filled with dust. But the empire did not count the dead. It counted coins. And what coins they were! The famous pieces of 8, stamped with the cross of Spain and the words Dei Gratia, by the grace of God. A currency soaked in divine authority and human misery, passed hand to hand from Peru to Manila, from London to Beijing. Spanish silver became the bloodstream of global trade. The empire was not just a nation anymore. It was an economy, vast, voracious, and unsustainable. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Spain's monarchs grew ever more grand and ever more broke. Charles V, the great emperor, spent his life fighting wars in every direction, against France, against the Ottoman Turks, against Protestant princes in Germany. His banners flew across Europe, his coffers emptied into every battlefield. And when he finally abdicated, exhausted, the empire passed to his son, Philip II, a man less flamboyant, but perhaps even more dangerous. Philip was not a warrior like his father. He was an administrator, methodical, cold, and utterly convinced that God had personally assigned him to defend Catholicism against a heretical world. If Charles had been the empire's sword, Philip was the empire's iron cage. He ruled from the Escorial, a gray stone palace that looked less like a home and more like a monastery designed by someone allergic to joy. Every wall, every hallway whispered of discipline,
order, and fear. Philip read reports late into the night about ships, taxes, heresies, while portraits of saints stared down from the walls, reminding him that sleep was for the faithless. Under Philip, the empire reached its greatest extent and its most dangerous fragility. Spain's fleets ruled the Atlantic, its soldiers dominated Europe, its colonies sprawled across the globe. But the very scale of it made control impossible. Governors fought over power, native revolts flared, piracy bled the treasure fleets dry. And still, Philip believed that more war, more faith, and more empire would fix everything. So he built the Armada. Ah, yes, the great, tragic, magnificent Spanish Armada. In 1588, Philip launched the largest fleet Europe had ever seen, intending to invade Protestant England and restore the true faith by canon and grace. The ships gleamed under the sun, sails white as communion cloths, blessed by priests and loaded with soldiers. England trembled. And then the wind changed. Storms tore the Armada apart, scattering it across the northern seas. Dozens of ships wrecked on the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Of 130 ships, barely half made it home. England celebrated it as divine intervention. Spain called it weather. But in truth, it was the empire's first real taste of failure. And failure, once acquired, has a way of lingering. The losses did not stop Spain's ambitions. Even as the seas grew hostile, the gold kept coming, for a while. The empire tried to hold itself together with faith, silver, and bureaucracy, but the more it conquered, the heavier it became. The weight of the world is not something even kings can balance. At home, peasants groaned under taxes meant to fund wars they would never see. Merchants complained that the economy was flooded with silver but starved of productivity. Inflation soared. And a strange thing began to happen. Spain, richest in the world, could not afford its own wealth. It's a classic imperial hangover. Too much conquest, not enough recovery. The empire had built a magnificent palace on sand. Let's step out of Europe again to the Philippines, where the empire's shadow fell across the Pacific. Manila, founded in 1571, became the farthest jewel in the crown, a city where Spanish, Chinese, and local cultures collided. From here, the famous Manila galleons sailed east, laden with silk, porcelain, and silver, linking Asia and the Americas in a single shimmering thread of commerce. It was globalization before the word existed. But even at this glittering edge of empire, life was a constant negotiation. Local revolts erupted. Chinese merchants were both vital and despised. Spanish friars preached salvation while extracting tribute. It was a world of contrasts, piety and greed, faith and violence, beauty and brutality. The empire's reach was astonishing. Its grasp, however, was already slipping. As the 17th century dawned, Spain began to feel the full cost of being everywhere at once. Wars in the Netherlands dragged on endlessly. France rose in defiance. England recovered from the Armada and began to flex its own imperial muscles. The oceans, once Spain's private highway, were now crowded with rivals. Dutch privateers, English corsairs, French opportunists. Everyone wanted a piece of the world Spain had so carelessly claimed. And as the empire fought to keep it, the treasure fleets grew slower, fewer, more vulnerable. The mines began to falter. The mountain of silver that had built the empire was hollowing out, literally and figuratively. But perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that Spain, in its pursuit of eternal glory, had begun to forget itself. The very heart of the empire, the land of Castile, the peasants in towns that had once formed its backbone, was decaying. Fields lay fallow, industry stagnated. Why work the land when silver bought everything? Why build when you could buy? Spain became a nation that imported everything and produced nothing except wars and prayers. The empire's greatest export was faith. Its greatest import was debt. Still, from the outside, the illusion endured. Visitors to Madrid saw the splendor. Cathedrals dripping in gold, processions of velvet-clad nobles, paintings that glowed with divine light. Artists like El Greco and Velázquez captured the strange melancholy of a world obsessed with grandeur and haunted by decline. It was as if Spain itself had become a painting, luminous, sacred, and quietly cracking at the edges. By the mid-1600s, the cracks were no longer subtle. The 30 Years' War drained what little life remained in Spain's treasury. The once invincible Spanish army was now a shadow, its soldiers unpaid, its officers corrupt. Revolts broke out in Catalonia, in Portugal, in Naples. The empire that had stretched across the globe was coming apart at its seams. And through it all, kings and ministers kept insisting it was God's plan. Perhaps they were right, but if it was divine design, it was a cruelly poetic one, that a nation that rose on faith and fortune would fall by both. A candle burns low in the Escorial. A clerk, exhausted, bends over parchment, tallying debts in a hand that trembles with fatigue. Somewhere far away, in a mine beneath Potosí, a boy coughs in the dark. A silver ingot cools in its mold. And between them, the king, the clerk, the miner, the empire hums softly like a dying star. Spain still believes it rules the world, but the world is beginning to whisper otherwise.
The sun never sets. They used to say the sun never set on the Spanish Empire, and they were right, for all the wrong reasons. It didn't set because it couldn't. There was always another war to fight, another rebellion to suppress, another debt to pay, another ship that hadn't come home. Even the stars must sleep, but the empire that never slept, refused to. By the early 1600s, Spain was still enormous on paper. Its maps glowed with crimson and gold, spreading across oceans and continents. Its fleets still sailed, its armies still marched, its kings still spoke in the language of destiny. But beneath the surface, the gears were grinding. The endless wars of the Habsburgs had turned glory into exhaustion. The silver that once flowed like rivers from the New World had slowed to a trickle. Inflation had hollowed the economy, and the Spanish countryside, the heart of Castile, was collapsing under the weight of taxation and neglect. The empire, in all its grandeur, was beginning to run on faith alone. And faith, however powerful, cannot pay for gunpowder. The Court of Madrid. A room heavy with velvet and incense. A king sits beneath a golden canopy, Philip III, the first monarch to inherit not an empire of conquest, but of maintenance. He is soft-spoken, devout, and deeply uninterested in politics. So he delegates, always a dangerous word in history, to favorites, ministers, and men of ambition. While Philip prays, others rule. Corruption blooms like ivy. The court becomes a theater of spectacle, balls, processions, masquerades. Spain, once fierce and ascetic, begins to resemble a tired nobleman, overdressed, for his own funeral. And yet the propaganda never falters. Painters like Velázquez capture kings as gods on earth, radiant, composed, immortal. The reality was less flattering, a dynasty already cracking from within. But if Spain's kings were tired, its enemies were not. The Dutch, those stubborn merchants of the north, refused to stay conquered. Their long revolt, which had begun under Philip II, dragged on for 80 years, a slow, expensive, humiliating drain on Spain's strength. The 80 Years' War, they called it. 80 years, nearly 4 generations of blood and debt. By the time peace came in 1648, the Dutch were free, rich, and building their own empire, the mirror image of Spain's, but leaner, sharper, and far more efficient. It was as if the torch of global dominance had quietly changed hands right under Spain's nose. Meanwhile, the French were rising. Across the Pyrenees, Louis XIII, and later Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, began to flex their muscles. Spain's once mighty Habsburg armies found themselves on the defensive, their reputation fading with each campaign. At the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, the invincible Spanish tercios, those legendary squares of pikes and muskets, were finally broken. Europe gasped, the symbol of Spanish military perfection shattered in a single afternoon. It was not just a defeat, it was a prophecy. At home, Spain's population dwindled. Famine swept the countryside. The plague returned, taking with it what little vitality remained. Even the clergy, once the empire's backbone, were stretched thin, overworked, underpaid, or too busy writing treatises to notice that their churches were emptying. But the empire did what empires always do when faced with decline. It doubled down on appearances. Cathedrals grew taller, palaces more extravagant, processions more dazzling. The poorer Spain became, the more gold it seemed to wear in public. It was like watching a candle burn brighter the closer it came to the end. And still, unbelievably, the empire continued to expand. Across the Pacific, Spain held on to the Philippines, extending its reach into Asia through trade with China and Japan. In the Americas, vast new cities, Mexico City, Lima, Bogota, became centers of art, architecture, and power. Baroque churches gleamed under tropical suns, their walls lined with gold leaf mined from the very earth they sanctified. From afar, Spain's empire still looked divine. Up close, it looked exhausted. Scene: the Royal Mint in Seville. Coins struck from silver, mined thousands of miles away. The clang of metal echoes through the hall, rhythmic, relentless. Each coin bears the image of a king and the words Hispaniarum Rex, King of the Spains. Each one is stamped with a dream, and each one, as it enters circulation, chips away at that dream's foundation. Because every ounce of silver devalued the last. Every ingot across the Atlantic made the next one worth a little less. Spain was drowning in its own treasure, an empire collapsing under the weight of abundance. They called it the price revolution, an innocent-sounding term for a financial earthquake. The more wealth Spain imported, the poorer it became. Its farmers could not compete. Its merchants were replaced by foreign bankers. The money that should have built an industrial future instead built cathedrals, armies, and debt. It is one of history's cruelest jokes that the richest empire on earth could not afford to feed itself. Philip IV tried to reform, to restore, to rally. He failed. Under his reign, Spain lost Portugal, Catalonia rebelled, and France carved away its pride piece by piece. And yet, in this twilight of failure, Spain produced some of its greatest art.
as if beauty itself was trying to apologize for reality. Velázquez painted Las Meninas, a portrait that seems to fold time and space into a single melancholy frame. The king reflected in a mirror, the painter himself gazing back, the princess glowing in a pool of light. It is a masterpiece of ambiguity, a mirror for an empire unsure of whether it's looking at itself or at its ghost.
By the late 1600s, Spain was a patient sustained by memory. The Habsburg dynasty, once so vast and commanding, had withered into a single tragic figure, Charles II, the Bewitched. He was sickly, childless, and rumored to be cursed, a man whose very body mirrored the decay of the empire he ruled. His jaw was deformed, his tongue too large to speak clearly, his mind clouded by superstition and paranoia. And yet he wore the crown of the world. When Charles died in 1700 without an heir, the Spanish Empire faced its greatest crisis, one that would decide the fate of Europe itself: the War of the Spanish Succession. The war was less about Spain and more about who would own its remains. France wanted to unite the crowns under the Bourbon dynasty. Austria wanted to keep it Habsburg. Britain and the Dutch wanted to keep both from becoming too powerful. It was, in essence, Europe fighting over a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead. The fighting raged for over a decade, across continents and seas. When it finally ended, Spain was left gutted. Stripped of most of its European territories, its influence shattered. But it survived. Barely. The new king, Philip V, the first of the Bourbon line, brought a breath of reform and a new French style of rule. The Escorial's cold austerity gave way to Versailles-inspired glitter. Spain began to modernize, patching its wounds, trimming its empire, pretending that it had never really fallen behind. But the truth was undeniable. The empire's age of conquest was over. What remained was maintenance, a slow, careful balancing act of power, politics, and denial. And yet, the sun still didn't set. Across the Atlantic, the colonies continued to grow, vast, beautiful, and restless. Creole elites, Spaniards born in the New World, began to feel the first whispers of independence. They looked at Madrid and saw distance, corruption, irrelevance. They looked at themselves and saw the future. Spain, clinging to its traditions, did not hear the storm approaching. It never does. In a church in Mexico City, a priest lights a candle beneath a gilded altar. Outside, the city hums, carriages, markets, laughter. Half a world away, in Madrid, another candle flickers in the royal chapel. Between the two flames stretches an ocean, a century, and an empire trying to convince itself that everything is fine. The sun still hasn't set, but the sky is turning gold, and then, slowly, gray. Cracks in the crown. By the dawn of the 18th century, Spain was an empire in name and a museum in practice. Its monuments still stood, magnificent and solemn. Its fleets still crossed the seas, its priests still preached, and its kings still issued decrees with all the authority of their ancestors. But the energy, the fire, that wild, unrelenting ambition that had once carved continents, was gone. In its place lingered nostalgia, bureaucracy, and debt. The War of the Spanish Succession had cost dearly. Spain had lost Belgium, Naples, Milan, and Gibraltar, a port the British, rather impolitely, decided to keep forever. But under Philip V, the first Bourbon king, the empire began to reform itself. It was no longer a crusading kingdom, it was becoming a modern state, whether it liked it or not. The court adopted French manners. The language of Versailles replaced the stiffness of Madrid. There were wigs now, powdered faces, orchestras, scientific academies. And yet, behind the curtains of refinement, the same old problems persisted. A weak economy,
a rigid class system, and an empire too vast to manage. Scene: the Palace of Madrid, 1750s. The king sits surrounded by advisors, charts and ledgers. Maps of the New World sprawl across the table, lines, trade routes, ports. Everywhere there are notes about gold shipments, sugar, tobacco, and the cost of defending it all. Spain's colonies were still rich, still loyal, still obedient, mostly. But something was changing, quietly, invisibly. The people of the Americas, the Criollos, Spaniards born overseas, were beginning to think differently. They read new ideas from Europe, words like reason and liberty. They looked at their own world and saw injustice, enormous wealth for a few, and endless labor for everyone else. They were Spaniards by blood, but not by power. And that gap, small at first, would become a chasm. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Spain's kings dreamed of revival. The Bourbon reforms swept through the empire, efforts to modernize, tax, centralize. The navy was rebuilt, colonies reorganized, trade liberalized. For a moment, it almost worked. Silver flowed again, bureaucracy tightened, the empire looked alive. But it was a dangerous kind of life, like a tree that blooms just before the frost. 1760s, the Caribbean. A humid dusk over Havana. British ships appear on the horizon, sleek, efficient, terrifying. In 1762, they took the city after a brief siege, humiliating Spain. It was a sign of things to come. Spain's fleets could no longer guarantee control over its own waters. The empire that once commanded the oceans now relied on treaties, alliances, and luck. Spain got Havana back in the peace that followed, but at a price. A reminder that the seas belonged to someone else now. The British Empire, that polite and stubborn cousin, had taken Spain's old playbook and rewritten it with better handwriting. 1770s. Across the Atlantic, something peculiar was happening in the northern colonies of another empire. 13 small British provinces decided they didn't need a king anymore. The American Revolution had begun, and Spain, though old, cautious, and perpetually Catholic, could not resist getting involved. They joined France in aiding the rebels, sending ships, guns, and money, hoping to weaken Britain and maybe regain some pride. It worked. Sort of. When the Americans won, Spain celebrated, briefly. But it also saw something frightening in that victory. A colony that had broken free and thrived. The whisper of rebellion began to echo in the Spanish Americas, in Caracas, in Bogota, in Buenos Aires, in Lima. Men with names that would soon become legends: Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, Miguel Hidalgo, José Martí, were still young, still unknown. But the ideas that would drive them had already been planted.
Mexico City, 1810. A church bell rings in the night. It's the Grito de Dolores, the cry of Father Miguel Hidalgo, calling for independence, for freedom from Spain. A priest holding a banner of the Virgin Mary shouts that God is with the people. And the people, tired of taxes and inequality and endless imperial neglect, believe him. The Mexican War of Independence had begun. Across the continent, revolutions exploded like sparks on dry paper. In Venezuela, Bolívar declared, "We are not Europeans, we are not Indians, we are a new race." In Argentina, José de San Martín led armies across the Andes, freeing Chile and Peru. Spain, distracted, impoverished, and weakened by its own internal chaos, could do almost nothing. The colonies, once the jewels of its crown, slipped away, one after another, like sand between trembling fingers. Back in Europe, things were somehow even worse. In 1808, the most humiliating chapter yet, Napoleon invaded Spain. The French army marched into Madrid, deposed the Bourbon king, and placed Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. The Spanish people erupted in fury. Peasants, priests, soldiers, everyone with a pitchfork or a musket took up arms. It was chaos. The Peninsular War, as it came to be known, became a brutal, grinding nightmare of resistance. Villages were burned, cities besieged, guerrillas, a new word born in this war, ambushed French patrols in the hills. Spain's own land turned into a battlefield, its own empire consuming itself from within. When Napoleon finally fell, Spain was free again. But it was not the same Spain. Its treasury was empty, its armies were exhausted, and by the time the Bourbons returned to power, the New World was gone. 1820s. One by one, Spain's colonies declared independence. Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Bolivar's dream of a free Latin America became real. By 1830, Spain's empire in the Americas had all but vanished. Only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained, fragile, proud remnants of a once global dominion. For the first time in nearly 4 centuries, Spain looked out at the Atlantic and saw not its reflection, but its absence. The port of Cadiz, 1835. The docks are quiet. Ships lie at anchor, their sails folded, their hulls creaking. The air smells of salt, wood, and melancholy. An old sailor, once a conquistador's grandson, stares at the horizon and mutters, "All that gold, and for what?" He's not wrong. Spain's riches had built palaces and cathedrals, yes, but also debt, war, and decline. Its conquests had spread faith and language across the world, but it had cost millions of lives. And now, in the silence of the harbor, it seemed as if the world had finally answered back, for nothing lasts forever. Still, Spain endured. It turned inward, nursing its wounds, reinventing itself as a kingdom of poets, painters, and dreamers rather than conquerors. Velázquez was gone, but Goya had taken his place. His paintings filled with shadows and anguish, portraits of madness and war. It was as if the empire's ghosts had found their voice in art. The Spanish Empire, the first global empire, had fallen, but its echoes remained everywhere. In the cathedrals of Mexico, in the plazas of Lima, in the churches of Manila, in the language spoken by 500 million people today. By the mid-19th century, Spain's role had changed. No longer a master of oceans, it became a quiet observer of the new empires rising. Britain, France, even the United States. Ironically, the world that Spain had helped to create, global trade, colonialism, maritime power, now belonged to others. But Spain could not let go. It held on to its last possessions, Cuba and the Philippines, with desperate pride. Until, of course, 1898, when history played its final, cruel trick, the Spanish-American War. A brief, almost pitiful conflict. A modern, industrialized America versus an exhausted, nostalgic Spain. When it ended, Cuba and the Philippines were lost. The empire was gone. 400 years of conquest, faith, and gold extinguished in a few months. And yet, in Madrid, the bell still rang. Because that's what empires do when they die. They keep ringing, hoping someone will still hear them. The sun had finally set on the Spanish Empire, but the world it had made, for better or worse, would never forget it. Its fall was not a collapse, but a slow exhale, centuries long, filled with pride, regret, and memory. Spain, that once blazing star, now shimmered as an ember, dim but still warm.
Echoes of dust and gold. The Spanish Empire is gone, but that is not the same as saying it disappeared. Empires, like rivers, do not vanish. They leave channels, sediments, echoes. You can trace Spain's empire in language, in faith, in cities and streets, in laws and libraries, in the tilt of a cathedral tower in Manila, in the Baroque plazas of Lima, in the words spoken across Latin America, echoing centuries of history. Even in absence, the empire persists, a ghost humming beneath the surface of the modern world. Think of the silver mined in Potosi, carried across oceans, stamped into coins, and shipped to Europe. It fueled wars in France, art in Italy, trade in China. The mountain may now be quiet, the mines abandoned, the miners long gone. But its influence lingers, a reminder that wealth, once released into the world, travels faster than armies ever could. The conquistadors, Cortez, Pizarro, and the countless unnamed men who carved kingdoms with swords and ambition are long dead. But their shadows stretch across centuries. Cities they founded still thrive. Cultures they suppressed, adapted, survived. The mixture of blood, faith, and fire they left behind became the soil for new nations. And yet, for every city that stands, every church that gleams, there are ruins, empty villages, and forgotten graves. The cost of empire is written in silence as much as in stone.
Spain itself learned to live in the afterglow. Gone were the galleons brimming with gold. Gone were the armies that marched across Europe with the inevitability of nightfall. Gone was the certainty that the world belonged to the crown. What remained was memory. The memory of triumph, the memory of cruelty, the memory of ambition so vast it could not be contained. In literature, in art, in the rhythm of festivals, in the music of guitars strung across plazas, Spain carried its past, quietly, insistently. It is a strange kind of immortality, an empire destroyed, yet alive in everything it touched. Consider the language. Spanish, spoken by billions today, is the most tangible echo of empire. It carries with it centuries of colonial administration, religious instruction, and cultural blending. In its cadence, in its idioms, in its songs and stories, you can hear the murmurs of the empire's history. Conquest, faith, tragedy, and hope all intertwined. Even in names, streets, towns, rivers, the imprint of Spain remains. It is a geography of memory, a map written in dust and gold. And yet the empire's end is not merely a story of loss. It is a story of transformation. From the ashes of conquest arose new nations, new voices, new cultures. The people who once labored under the Spanish crown became citizens of independent republics, architects of their own destinies. Spain's fall was the beginning of countless beginnings elsewhere. History, in this sense, is both cruel and generous. It destroys empires and nourishes the world beyond them. It leaves ruins for some and opportunity for others. And through it all, the sun keeps rising, sometimes over Madrid, sometimes over Lima, sometimes over Manila, indifferent, relentless, eternal. Twilight over Madrid. The city glows under a fading sun. Church bells ring across rooftops. A few pedestrians stroll along cobblestone streets, unaware that centuries ago their ancestors' ambition had reshaped half the world. The empire's ghosts linger quietly in the stones, in the air, in the stories whispered late at night. But for the most part, life goes on. And perhaps that is the empire's final lesson. Power is fleeting. Gold turns to dust. Armies crumble, and crowns decay. Yet influence, subtle, pervasive, cultural,
endures longer than any monarch's ambition, longer than any treasure fleet. Spain's empire is gone, but its shadow is everywhere. And maybe, just maybe, that is immortality enough. A candle burns low in a quiet study. Maps of the world, yellowed and folded, lie on the table. A historian, old and soft-spoken, traces a finger along the routes of galleons, the mountains of silver, the cities of conquest. He sighs, and the candle flickers. The wind rustles the pages. The night is calm, and the world, still shaped in part by those long-ago ambitions, sleeps quietly beneath stars that have witnessed it all. The Spanish Empire is over, and yet everywhere you look, it whispers, "Remember me." And in remembering, we are never truly free of it.